And today we start nearing the end of this chapter and the end of this decade, the 1850s. In fact, we are now finally going to get to the end of the decade as we talk about the election of 1860. We have essentially one more event that will be what we've been referring to as a swing of this hammer, knocking this wedge deeper and deeper into our country. And that final swing of the hammer, even after John Brown's raid, we still are not at war until this one final event. In 1860, we have a presidential election, and in many ways, it is the final straw that breaks the camel's back, as they say, right? So I'd like to start talking about this particular election with this one statement right here. The statement says, "The success of the American political process rests on the ability of the losers to accept the government of the winners." So think about that for a second and read that to yourself again. I'll repeat it one more time. The success of the American political system rests on the ability of the losers to accept the government of the winners. That's how our system is set up in terms of elections, in particular with presidential elections. When one president loses an election, when people who voted for that particular president don't have their guy that they voted for or girl win, those people, the candidate and the voters, have to accept whatever the winners actually put into place for the next 4 years or whatever it might be. Excuse me, if we're talking about a presidential election. It's always worked that way, except in 1860. So we're going to find out what we mean by that and what actually ends up happening. So we've learned quite a bit about the political parties in the decade and the different parties that existed. We knew that over the 1850s, the Democratic Party had been sort of fracturing and splitting into two, Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. Well, by the election of 1860, it finally happens. So much so that each party, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, nominate two different candidates. Well, each party nominates one candidate, two Democratic candidates. The Northern Democrats are going to nominate Stephen A. Douglas. This shouldn't be that big of a surprise to you. One, because Stephen A. Douglas is at this point a prominent politician in the country. We already learned that Stephen A. Douglas had grand plans of running for president eventually, and here he is. It also is a reminder that the stance on slavery of the Northern Democratic Party was this idea of popular sovereignty. They weren't pro-slavery or anti-slavery, and of course we know Stephen A. Douglas has really exploited that idea throughout the 1850s. All right, that leaves the other half of the party, the Southern Democrats. They nominate a completely separate candidate in John C. Breckinridge. Do you remember what the Southern Democratic Party's stance on slavery was? You should remember this. South Democrat, this is the pro-slavery and, dare I say, expansion of slavery party. So we've got one popular sovereignty candidate, we've got one pro-slavery candidate. The third party that we're going to discuss is that new party, the party that had just broken into the scene in the 1850s, and that was this newly formed Republican Party. All right, so leading up to this election, the Republican Party really had a guy who seemingly was the best candidate. He was sort of the leader of this new party. His name is William Seward. But the Republicans realized that nominating William Seward just might not be their best choice. He's so anti-slavery. His views about abolishing slavery are so extreme that they're definitely not going to win any votes in the South with this candidate, and there might even be some Northern voters who might look at this guy and say, you know what, he's a little bit too extreme with the anti-slavery stuff. So they got to come up with somebody else. Somebody that's going to appeal to these Northern voters and not turn them off with his anti-slavery views. Who is that guy? You know him, you love him. He's the newcomer on the scene. The guy that didn't win the Senate seat in 1858 out there in Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. He is the nominee for President of the United States by the Republican Party. We know that the newly formed Republican Party is the anti-slavery party, but we also know that Lincoln had this more moderate approach to that. Even though he was openly anti-slavery, he always had the ability to do what with the conversation and the discussion? He could always bring it back to this idea of keeping the country together. And people like that message, so he's their guy. Well, why not add another political party? The American Party's not going to be in this race because, as we learned earlier, they don't really count because they're not talking about slavery. So a whole nother party is formed called the Constitutional Union Party. It is a party that's made up of a handful of people that are sort of in the middle of this issue. Most of them are from the border states. We know these border states are those slave states that are still trying to stay connected to the North. They formed the Constitutional Union Party, and they nominated a guy named John Bell. All right? So this is the stage being set for the election of 1860. 4 candidates, 4 different parties, a lot of different ideas about slavery. I said that John Bell and this Constitutional Union Party come out of the formation of what we are now going to start calling these border states. We've been talking about them, but this is the first time we've put the definition in our notes, so I wanted to add it here. The border states are those slave states that will remain loyal to the Union. When the war begins, there are 4 and then eventually 5 states that are southern slave states that never secede. And yes, the Union will fight in the Civil War against the Confederacy with 5, what will end up being 5 slave states as part of that Union. Those are, as a reminder, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Which one am I missing here? The one that doesn't exist yet in 1860, and that is West Virginia. So let me give West Virginia some props later. All right. So what ends up happening with the way this is working out is that there is going to end up being a sectional election. What I mean by that is the election almost turns out to be as if it's 2 separate elections in 2 different sections of our country. It's not. It's one election with 4 candidates for 1 presidential winner. But in the North, anyone that goes out to vote in this election only really considers 2 of the 4 candidates as a possibility. If you go to vote in the North, you are only choosing really between Lincoln and Douglas. Now, the other guys are on your ballot, Bell and Breckinridge, but they're not even a consideration. Most Northerners are going to say, do I want the anti-slavery Lincoln Republican or this popular sovereignty thing with the Northern Democrats, and I'll vote for Douglas. And the same is true in the southern states. In the southern section of our country, anyone that goes out to vote is only choosing between 2 guys. Nobody's voting for Lincoln in the South. He's the anti-slavery guy. Nobody's voting for these Northern Democrats that are going this popular sovereignty route. Everybody is on board with these Southern candidates and their support for slavery. So you're either voting for Bell or Breckinridge. In fact, in some Southern states, Lincoln and Douglas weren't even on the ballots. But even the ones where their names did appear, nobody even looked at them. They weren't considering them. And so this creates a very unique situation and a very good situation for the guy who is the eventual winner. So everybody goes out and votes. In the North, they're picking between these 2. In the South, they're picking between these 2. And in the end, Abraham Lincoln wins the election of 1860. He wins the majority of electoral college votes. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the voters, or where the section of the country where he is essentially running for president, is the North. There are more people in the northern states than in the South. There are more electoral votes in those states because of the population. And it essentially means that Lincoln doesn't have to win some overwhelming majority because there's 4 separate candidates. Think about it this way. If, like in most elections that we're familiar with, there are 2 candidates running, 2 major candidates. if we just think of it in terms of the lowest percentage of the vote that you can win and still have a majority, what would that be if there's two candidates? If you win 51% of the vote, that means your opponent won 49. You win. But if there's 4 candidates and the votes are all spread out between 4 different choices, theoretically, and it didn't work out exactly this way, but just to illustrate the point, what percentage of the vote, what's the smallest percentage of the vote any one of these guys could win and win an actual majority? Technically, with 4, you can win 26% of the vote, and then that means all the other 3, and if the other 3 split the rest of it equally, they'd all have 24 or 25%. And with 26% of the vote, you could win, technically. That's not how it worked out. Lincoln does get a higher percentage than that, but the way that this sectional election with 4 candidates worked out, and then the fact that Lincoln was in the section of the country where there were more votes to be had in the North, it created an advantage for Lincoln, and he ends up winning this election. He does so without any electoral votes from any southern states. And it's just the way it turned out. And he was able to win with all northern electoral votes. Now think about that for a second. He had no southern electoral votes. How do you think Southerners felt when they found out that their new president, the president of the United States of America for all of the states, didn't get 1 vote from the South? The Southerners viewed that as if their votes didn't count. The way they look at it is, hey, we could have all stayed home. None of us voted, and it wouldn't have made a difference. Because we all went out and voted, none of us voted for this Lincoln guy, and he's the winner, he's our president. So this is what creates this final sort of push for something that people have been talking about, but this is the final push for those Southerners to start talking about breaking away from the Union. Southerners felt that the government was now out of their hands, that the Republican Party wins and Lincoln wins with no votes from the South, and what that means is that the North is taken over and they're going to just take away our slaves, basically, is the way they started looking at it. And so these secessionists started to argue that the southern states had the right to secede or leave the Union. The first state to do that is South Carolina. South Carolina secedes from the United States of America about a month after the election on December 20th, 1860. As soon as South Carolina seceded, it was sort of a leader in the South as a state. 6 other southern states followed South Carolina's lead, and these 7 states create what becomes known as the Confederate States of America. This is the beginning of the Confederacy. These 7 southern states elect their own president. After this election of 1860, they decide to go with someone completely different, a senator from Mississippi, a guy named Jefferson Davis. So he will be the guy that will lead the Confederate nation throughout the Civil War as their president. All right, this is where I wanted to get to today in this video, to the results of the election, and finally, after all these days and all these lessons through the 1850s of all these crazy things, finally it's happened. The southern states have seceded and created the Confederacy. All right, but the story's not over. There is still more to come.